Good afternoon. Welcome to SGA's 2020 annual meeting, and thank you all for joining session 3A. I'm Brandon Wasson from the Program Committee, and I will be serving as your moderator for this session. This session will feature one presentation, which will last about 45 minutes, including a Q&A period at the end. Our presenters this afternoon are Meaghan O'Riordan of Emory University and Rosemary Davis of Yale University, who will be speaking on the role of accessioning in effective archival stewardship. Thank you very much for sharing with us this afternoon, and I'll hand the session over to you now.
Yay! There she is. All right, Meaghan, take it away.
Me?
Oh, I can start. I think we have like some idea that maybe like, I don't know. First off, let's just start with this. This is a link to our session resources. So it's a Google Doc that is a link to our slides, that is a link to the text of both of our talks, as well as just like a very short bibliography for some of the things that we cited. So you can go to that at any time. It also has a link to the website that we created about our project research. And that kind of just has like the ongoing progress of it, updates, things like that. It's just kind of a gloss of what we're doing and where we're going. We kind of update it as we go. Here's the structure of our little session. So we're going to kind of just go through some of the problematic definitions that we've encountered, some of the better definitions that we've encountered of accessioning, and then just basically do a section by section breakdown on our research project, talk a little bit about funding, and then have time for Q&A. So pretty straightforward. All right, let's see. Okay, so I'm Rosemary Davis. I am very thankful for all of you for joining us today. Thank you to SGA for organizing this, and thank you, of course, to my research partner, Meaghan. I am the Accessioning Archivist at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale, and I've been in this role since 2016. And currently, I'm one member of a 7-person team who are all working on accessioning manuscript material. So Meaghan and I first met on a panel at SAA 2018, and all the speakers were either performing or managing accessioning work. And to me, it was a revelation to hear so many voices talking about the diverse experiences of doing this work, to hear like my own frustrations and curiosities and questions fluttering around in the corner of their talks, and to know that there was basically just like so much more to learn about how accessioning could be done better. Meaghan and I bonded over the fact that neither of us had ever done really accessioning at all before we were hired full-time to do accessioning. And that spun into conversations about how our job descriptions deviated from the day-to-day like realities of what we were doing, and how we both felt adrift without a community of folks, how we didn't see our work reflected in archival scholarship. And so we decided to build a project that was geared towards more accurately representing the actuality of accessioning. And I know it's super prosaic, but I'm going to start with a definition. So this is the recently revised SAA Dictionary of Archives Terminology, and they have a very lean definition for accessioning. As a noun, an accession represents a unit of acquisition that's very straightforward. But then we get to this problematic little verb form, which is to take intellectual and physical custody of materials, often under legal or policy authority. Now, this definition isn't exactly wrong, but it also isn't anywhere near comprehensive. It doesn't reflect the incredibly complex work that contemporary accessioning often now entails. And I mentioned earlier that Meaghan and I had commiserated about a historical lack of archival scholarship devoted to exploring accessioning, and that is certainly evident in this definition. It draws on a very narrow historical interpretation of accessioning, and it portrays it as a singular workflow element instead of a cluster of duties that kind of build and rely upon each other. This quote is kind of a good encapsulation of what I'm talking about here, and I want to read it out verbatim. In the United States, archival accessioning practice has evolved over 200 years, a continual negotiation of the nature and value of archival labor. As the archival profession emerged and standards for description were developed, Accessioning matured from a mere register in a logbook to a core function in the continuum of extensible archival processing. This comes from a forthcoming book by Audrey Eagle-Yoon. She is the head of special collections and archives and also the university archivist at University of California, Irvine Libraries. She, along with a handful of really amazing other practitioners, have created a book that will serve as a tremendous piece of scholarship and an incredible teaching resource, so that, imagine it, you could actually learn about accessioning in library school instead of just having it sprung upon you as a thing that you have to now figure out. Their book is finally going to give context to the development of accessioning work over time, and it'll show the multiplicity of ways that accessioning practices have outgrown the traditional, pretty restrictive definition. And so I want to pop back to definitions a little bit. Look at the beautiful, succinct nature of this definition. In 2018, Rachel Circe, who is accessioning archivist for NYU Libraries, kind of transformed the traditional custodial interpretation of accessioning in her article, Beyond Control, Accessioning Practices for Extensible Archival Management. And that article really illuminates kind of the keystone role of accessioning and yields this much more nuanced definition. Even though it is short, it contains multitudes. And it really situates accessioning as a function that allows archivists to, in her words, examine, analyze, stabilize, and document our knowledge about a grouping of archival materials upon their arrival in order to confirm stewardship of them. Now, Circe's definition makes so much more space for the reality of accessioning, which, instead of exclusively being understood as, this finite function, is actually something much more like this very intense chart. Now, you can see in this how all these individual elements of accessioning work kind of interlock and overlap. Look at all the arrows, look at all the dots. They create this interdependent life cycle that collection material can move through in a variety of directions. And if you zoom out, you can see the connective threads between accessioning labor types and complex operational goals for a repository. Those dotted lines, they represent important interactions and workflows, internal and external relationships working in concert. And that leads us to an expanded definition that Meaghan and I are in the process of devising. It's still very much in progress. It's going to change, it's going to grow, it's going to contract, it's going to do a lot of things, but it builds on Circe's very excellent foundation. All right, so this is where we are right now. Archival accessioning is a rich hybrid of pre and post custodial work that requires physical, intellectual, and emotional labor. Duties can include appraisal, packing and transportation, archival description, legal and financial documentation, donor relations, documentation of archival decisions, preservation measures, and space management. Effective accessioning practices are foundational to ethical, transparent collection stewardship and have an impact on every facet of the archival lifecycle. I think what really separates our definition from more pared down versions is the acknowledgement of different types of labor that are required here. And that's what our research is really trying to uncover. What does the lived experience of performing accessioning actually look like for those of us who are doing it? What types of relationships have to be cultivated, nourished, and maintained? And what kind of resources are given to the people, to support the people who are doing this work? Meaghan and I knew right away that we wanted our research to take a humanistic approach. And so to us, that absolutely meant we wanted the voices of many others to take up a majority of the space in our project's output. And so that leads us to kind of the first big component of our research practice. Site visits, in-person visits by either Meaghan, myself, or ideally both of us, because we are a very good team. So site visits, in-person visits to different repositories so we can see firsthand how accessioning functions in the field. And before COVID-19 threw a very unceremonious wrench into our plans, we had 22 site visits planned in different regions of the United States. It's a very long list, and we were able to complete 13 of those site visits between August 2019 and February 2020, which is awesome. but it's just kind of, we had to put everything on pause. So as of today, we still have 9 visits left to do from our original list, but we also really want to make sure that we're being as inclusive and broad-based as possible when it comes to this work. So in addition to our original hit list, we are hopefully going to be organizing either physical or virtual site visits to repositories in 5 other geographic areas of the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii. Those will definitely be virtual, but we still want to make sure that they're included. For the site visits we've been able to do so far, I just can't even tell you how immensely enlightening it's been to spend literal hours hearing directly from people about their work, seeing the spaces where they store materials and process them, to actually just hear organic conversations about relationships with curators and colleagues. And it's really helped us to get a clearer picture of how accessioning works when it comes down to just doing the work. So let's talk about what a site visit looks like. Every visit takes kind of a similar structure. We make pre-visit contact with folks to share our comprehensive survey, which Meaghan is going to talk about more in depth in a minute, and to make sure that everyone meeting with us will have an idea of the types of questions that we'll be asking once we show up. When we arrive, we acclimate folks to the project. We talk about what we're most interested in gaining out of the visit, and we make space to hear for what they'd like to gain from us being there. What questions do they have from us? What can we share with them that will be helpful? And we make it very, very clear that the goal of these visits is community building, is making connections between our work and their work, and then hopefully a wider network of people doing this. Next up, and maybe kind of our favorite thing, low-key, maybe not even low-key, is a tour of the spaces, a tour of all physical spaces for storage, for processing, for intake of collection materials. And let me tell you that we absolutely get excited every single time someone says, do you want to see our loading dock? And we're like, yes, absolutely. Also, where's your elevator? Also, do you have a pallet jack? And these are the questions that we are very invested in getting answers to. And it's the type of question that comes up much more easily when you are there in person, as opposed to a virtual interaction wherein people are usually kind of pegged to one place. It's easier to kind of steer yourself through that experience when you're there, which is why we kind of had to advocate so hard for this to be a part of the research. So after the tour of the physical spaces, we have a long conversation about how accessioning works at the repository. And, we ask tons and tons of questions, including but not limited to how are duties assigned and managed, what kind of technology is being used to document collection information. Is it archive space? Is it Excel? Is it a combination of things? How is accessioning work in this place evolved or not, as sometimes the case is? We ask what kind of relationships exist between the archivists and the curators, between archivists and their other counterparts at that place, between vendors, between donors. We ask how all of those things work and how they're maintained. But then we also get into do you have what you need to do this work? Can you get what you need if you ask for it? What don't you have, and how have you had to compensate for the lack of those resources? And then we also, it gets a little, personal sometimes, and we ask them, do you feel respected? Do you feel like your work is understood by your colleagues and by your community? What is the vibe of you doing this work, and how does that have an impact on you when you're doing it? And then after that is all done, after we're gone, we always follow up with people. And a lot of times the form that follow-up takes is not only just some questions that have popped up, between the time that, we walk out the door and the time we get to the hotel and we're like, oh, no, we forgot to ask this, but it's also really much more about sharing documentation. So sharing resources like documented workflows, like processing guides, like templates for, inventories or things of that nature, basically any kind of documentation that's used to support accessioning work, because we want to see what's working for people, or what kind of workarounds they've had to create in order to be successful. So while these, the slide from earlier, while this is kind of, the primary foci of our research project, you can really boil it down even further to it's about these things. It's about empathy, documentation, and visibility. It's about making sure that we are making connections with people, that we are documenting their experiences, but also collecting the documentation of their work, of their labor, so that other people can learn from it, and making that work visible, making those experiences visible to a wider range of people, so they can understand what it takes to do this work. So yeah, that's now it's your turn, Meaghan. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. So as both Rosemary and Brandon mentioned, I'm Meaghan O'Riordan, and I am the Accessioning Archivist at the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library at Emory University. I have also been in my role since 2016. I think this is the first time I realized that we started around the same time. And while I collaborate with other staff at the Rose on accessioning, I am the primary person responsible for accessioning. I can't do it all myself with the volume that we collect, but also there really is mostly just me. So thanks to Rosemary for giving an excellent gloss of how we got started and what we were working on prior to the pandemic. It's important to note that we were definitely entrenched in getting those site visits completed prior to doing other work, but COVID-19 said nope, and so we had to pivot. A major part of our pivot has been to turn our attention to writing about the data that we had already gathered, since we don't know when we'll be able to gather more data. And a really low-hanging fruit for that has been to analyze what we gathered from the survey that we circulated in the fall of 2019. Could you advance the slide, please? So we left the survey open for about 2 months. Technically, it's still open. So if anyone wants to take it, just, send us a note. And we were really astounded at the response. We received 169 responses total. 118 of those were 100% complete, and 141 were 50% or more complete. And this is especially, I think that's a good response rate no matter what, but especially for this survey, it was very long with several free text fields. So the fact that 118 people made it all the way through and another 23 didn't stop until they had passed the halfway mark is quite remarkable. So I'm going to go over some preliminary findings from that data. I have pretty much just presented on a few questions that were not free text fields, pretty much. And there is a plan to write a comprehensive report of the survey results to be published somewhere. So I invite you all to read that whenever that time comes for more. Next slide. So I'll start with the institution type. This is not super exciting data because most of the respondents identified as belonging to academic institutions, and that included 100 respondents. This was multi-select, so there's more than 100 responses represented here, but considering the nature of archival accessioning work, that wasn't too surprising. Next slide. Much like our site visits, we are trying to really get a geographic diversity in those, and we are thankful that that is somewhat represented in the responses to the survey. The two highest regions are Northeastern and Southeastern, and at 39 respondents each, and that's where Rosemary and I are situated, and then we can nag people into participating in our research. But, we still got pretty good ground covered otherwise. We were very excited to hear from our Canadian friends and even one New Zealander, but we recognize that the results from our data will ultimately have a strong US bias. Next slide. One of the pieces or sets of answers that I have found really interesting and have talked about sort of offhandedly in other conversations is when we asked for people to give us their title. So there were 107 unique answers out of 169, but we kind of came up with these categories, and some people had titles that represented more than one category, and so they were counted for each category. So this actually represents 194 answers, and 39% identified as a processing archivist of some kind, most often a generalist, but sometimes with a subject specialty. 21% identified as someone in charge, a head, a manager, a director, something like that. 12.5% identified as working specifically with institutional archives, and that was primarily university archives since most of our respondents were at academic institutions. 9% identified as a librarian, and sometimes that was in conjunction with archivists and sometimes it wasn't. 7% responded with titles that indicated a paraprofessional role with words like assistant, processor, and specialist in their titles. 8 people identified as working with digital materials, and 6 people identified as curators. And 2% identified as collection managers. That used to be me, but I didn't get to select that this time. And then most significant for our research is that there were only 6 respondents, 3%, that had the word accessioning in their title. And spoiler alert, Rosemary and I were 2 of them. So only 4 people besides us. So on the left, for the top 4 categories, just gave a little look into the kinds of titles that we counted for these categories. So assistant archivist, lead archivist, processing archivist, archivist for special collections. We sort of lumped all those people together. We're not necessarily surprised by the fact that there weren't that many people with the word accessioning in their title for many reasons. I mean, we had been trying to find people to go visit, and it was sort of difficult sometimes to figure out who it was who was responsible for accessioning. And historically, as Rosemary mentioned, it's been hard to find each other, and this is part of the reason why. It's only recently that more institutions have been hiring specifically for accessioning roles. The most surprising result from this question was the low number of paraprofessional roles. In our experience, if and when jobs are posted for accessioning, they tend to be paraprofessional in nature, but perhaps that trend is changing. When we specifically asked how their jobs were classified, only 8 people or 5% selected the paraprofessional option, and another 4 selected other and indicated, some part of admin. Likely the other roles that we identified by the title as being paraprofessional either aren't or they selected in the following question, professional librarian archivist staff, because, and this is my case, staff roles at Emory are paraprofessional. So librarians or archivists are in non-tenure track faculty roles. So there could be any number of reasons for the discrepancy. It's hard to know from these results if more people are being hired for professional roles to do accessioning work, or if our survey simply did not reach paraprofessionals. Additionally, paraprofessionals often have less time to devote to extra work, like taking a survey for research. So there's a lot of reasons why this might not reflect sort of our hypothesis. And we can maybe try to have hope that it's that we're being more professionalized to look at the glass half full. Next slide, please. So the next sets of data are about the amount of material that people acquire in accession annually. So first respondents were asked how much they acquire, Then they were asked how much they accession. So the purple line is the number of response for acquired, and the green line is for accessioned. So 32% said they acquire 100 to 500 linear feet, 30% less than 100 linear feet. And then it goes down from there, 16% for 500 to 1,000, 12% for 1,000 plus, and 10% for I don't know, not tracked. So the majority of respondents acquire somewhere between 0 and 500 linear feet per year. When asked how much they accession each year, it was the same majority. The numbers are a little different, but 34% 100 to 500, 33% less than 100, and then it goes down from there. Next slide, please. This slide gets a little into the weeds, but one of the things that Rosemary and I are very familiar with is how much the rate of collecting is often different from our ability to accession that material. So I really wanted to compare the answers directly. So did a person who say that they collected less than 100 feet also say that they accessioned less than 100 feet, or was there a difference? So the purple line is how many, is the respondents who said this is how much we acquire. And then each green line is those same people, what they said for how much they accession. So that's what you're looking at. So you'll see that for most of the levels, the folks answered the same. But there were 24 respondents who answered those two questions differently. And of those 24 who answered differently, 66% or 16 respondents collect more material annually than they accession. 4 people, 17%, said they accession more than they collect. And then 4 people, 17%, only knew or only tracked one or the other of those metrics, but they didn't track both of them. So we would have expected more institutions to collect more than they accession rather than the other way around. So that makes sense, but it is surprising that only 16% gave different answers for these questions. One thing I would say about this is that for me at the Rose Library, we acquire and accession the same amount of material. So it's possible I answered the questions the same. And our number is around 800 linear feet, but the 800 linear feet that we accession is not the 800 linear feet that we acquired. Right now, especially because of the pandemic, we're about 2 years between receipt and accession. So even if I answered the question with the same answer, it doesn't necessarily mean what it seems like it means, that you're accessioning on par with your collecting. So we could have maybe found some other ways to ask this kind of question. Next slide. So this is the set of results that will make everyone feel good and breathe a sigh of relief. 132 respondents, or 87%, answered yes to the question as to whether or not they had an accessioning backlog. And every institution we went to pre-pandemic, when we asked that question, they were sort of hesitant, and we were like, literally everyone has said yes. So feel okay about it. Normalize having a backlog. Only 11 respondents said no. 9% selected other, and when they selected other, they said they have a processing backlog, but not an accessioning backlog, or that material really doesn't sit on their shelves for longer than a few months, so they don't really consider that to be a backlog. We knew from the site visits that we were not alone, but seeing a number like 87% really dilutes any backlog shame that we might have been harboring. So next slide. So when asked, do you provide researcher or user access to material that has been accessioned with minimal baseline or no processing work completed? 30% said yes with minimal or baseline processing. 20% said yes with either. 18% said no, and 11% said with no processing work completed. Another 21% answered other, and most said in the free text field, it depends, an archivist's favorite answer. In general, providing access to accession material depended upon the presence of PII, other sensitive information, or an inventory, if there was an inventory already, and the skills and needs of the researcher. Most indicated if they selected other, that they would provide access to unprocessed or minimally processed material on a case-by-case basis, assessing the stability of the material, any legal or privacy concerns, and the needs of the researchers. We were pleasantly surprised that 61% gave some kind of affirmative answer, and only 18% still has a blanket answer of no. The 21% who answered other is a bit concerning because it sounds like from the free text field answers that there are many barriers in place to prevent access to newly acquired material. Only some of those who gave the answer were dealing with institutional records that would include more concerns than the average manuscript collection. So it's not really clear why it's on a case-by-case basis. Next slide. So when asked, do you or other individuals performing accessioning work at your organization or institution ever take part in pre-custodial decisions or discussions? 84% said yes. And 16% said no, which was a pleasant surprise that we are, meaning the collective, we are being included in those discussions. We followed up with a multi-select question to ask how they participate in those discussions, and 23% said site visits, 22% said acquisitions and curatorial discussions, 21% said formats assessment, 20% said appraisal, 12% said operational impact review, and 2% selected other. For that other, they said things like retention guidelines, condition assessments, and cultivating donor relationships. Last chart, next slide, please. Or charts, I should say. So please don't get overwhelmed. This is sort of all representing a theme here. These are, for the labor questions, which is sort of core to our research, we mostly asked free text field questions, but we did start off with multi-select questions to get a sense of generally how people are performing these different kinds of labor. So these slides will be available and you can see, but the main thing I would like to point out is that we didn't really miss too many of the aspects that people do. People who selected other often mention sort of really niche ways that they participate in those relationships. The other thing I'll say is that you can see just by looking at the bars that, like Rosemary was saying in the beginning, we do all of these things and we need documentation that or definitions and professional recognition that shows that we do all of these things. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, I put this little pie chart, which asked, with whom do you perform all of these things? And 50% still selected alone. 15% selected with other staff who are not necessarily tasked with accessioning, which is me. 12% with other staff tasked with accessioning, which is Rosemary. And then 12% selected other. So a lot of us are still doing this by ourselves or with people who actually aren't dedicated to accessioning. And I think that's probably something that we would like to change. Next slide. So in terms of other future projects, until we can travel again, we've been focused on establishing a formal network for people performing accessioning work. as well as developing nationally recognized best practices. During the annual meeting of SAA this year, we circulated a petition to create a new section for accessioning. Because SAA is evaluating all component groups and trying to decide what changes to make them more useful to members and the profession, they're not ready to establish a new section for us yet, even though we did have incredible support. We had 133 total signatures and 120 of those were from membership. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to merge with the acquisitions and appraisal section, which will formally adopt accessioning as part of its name, and it will be more directly in support of that function. In the future, there's still a possibility for a separate section, but it just depends on what happens with component groups overall. Next slide. We also have a Slack channel called Accessioning Collective that we started for people to connect with one another outside of professional organizations, and we encourage anyone interested to request an invitation to join. The workspace name is called Accessioning Collective, and we currently have 45 members. We use the space to share resources and experience, and anyone who participates in accessioning work can join. Next slide. Finally, we have started taking steps toward creating best practices for accessioning that will be nationally recognized. SAA Standards Committee has approved us to move forward in that process, and we will be forming a working group under whatever acquisitions and appraisal changes its name to. Additionally, we have applied for an IMLS grant in order to facilitate 2 workshops to write these best practices. Our intention is for one of those to occur prior to SAA 2022, and one of them to occur the spring following and be a multi-day retreat. Our goal is to subsidize the cost for every working group member. So if you're interested in participating, be on the lookout for a short application process to open in the new year. Now, Rosemary will take a moment to discuss funding in more detail.
Yeah, I think, Meaghan hit a lot of the stuff, but we kind of wanted to just at the last moment kind of zoom in a little bit on the complications of getting money to do this type of work. So yeah, we're both very fortunate to work in large, well-funded institutions. Both of us have wonderful managers who support us, and not only support us directly, but they also advocate for our work to others, which can't be understated as a thing that is necessary for this type of thing. Each of us have access to some amount of paid work time to devote to research, and this is very exceptional. Not everybody has this type of support, and we're very well aware of that. And yet, we find ourselves having to very persistently and continuously try to find financial resources to support our research. And we thought it'd be helpful to just kind of give a quick gloss on what that looks like. So locally speaking, Meaghan was able to secure some funding from Emory libraries to cover the financial costs incurred by performing site visits. And likewise at Yale, I applied for a small research grant from a library group within the university. I received a fraction of what I asked for, but the Beinecke very helpfully stepped in to cover the gap for that. But like I said, just as important as the financial resources, the direct financial resources that we've gotten from our institutions, is the time that has been afforded us to spend some of this time while we're at work, but also to perform the site visits. That's a crucial thing. At the national level, it will come as no surprise to most of you that funding opportunities for this type of research are few and far between. There are tons of grants and stipends and awards out there for individuals who are performing research with archival materials, but only a scant few that actually fund research being performed about how archival work is done. So the closest match for us and something that was successful in our work was the Strategic Growth Grant from the SAA Foundation. This is a relatively new program. It's only been around for a couple of years, and we were one of 4 awardees earlier this year. We got $5,000, and once travel becomes safe again, we're going to be using it to expand the geographic scope of our site visits, and we're going to be visiting repositories in the Pacific Northwest, in the Southwest, and in the kind of lower Midwest, like, think Kansas, Missouri, kind of like in the little middle, breadbasket and breadbasket adjacent section of the country. And then finally, when it comes to federal, the options are even fewer, and application processes are also infinitely more complex. Like Meaghan said, we're currently in the process of an IMLS leadership grant application. And that's going to be, hopefully, if we receive the funding to fund that summit, that we want to use for a working group to kind of finalize a first draft of best practices. We want all expenses to be paid, including work stipends for everybody who attends. And we're talking in the neighborhood of 20 people, including, 20 people plus us. And so that's a, not insignificant chunk of change, and it would be extremely dreamy if we could figure out how to pull it off. We recently submitted our preliminary proposal, and we're waiting to hear if we make it to the invited proposal level. But it is so much work. And also, this grant isn't something that you can apply for as an individual. It has to be through a university or like a granting institution. And so we had to apply through the grants office in Yale. And when it's all said and done, if we are successful, Yale gets to take a huge chunk of that money for facilitation costs. And of course, that's how the game is played. But, that just kind of loops us back to our local connections and our local privilege. Working at large institutions that have these types of resources is allowing us to apply for this grant. So, we are very lucky. We are very hardworking, but it's very plain that finding the kind of support that enables this type of research is difficult to the point of impossible for many people. And again, that's just why we want to make sure that our research includes as many voices that aren't ours as possible, so that, it can be, we can be doing it for the betterment of lots of other people. So I think we're done. So now we can take questions.
Thank you, Rosemary, and thank you, Meaghan. I think we might have time for one quick question if someone has a question. Of course, you all saw the invitation to join the Slack group, and so that might be a great place to ask questions as well beyond this session. But if someone does have a quick question, we do have a question by James Cross. If you could post the 2 URLs from the beginning of your talk, or put them in the chat, that would be helpful.
There are resources, and there are those, and I will post them in the chat right now.
And then if either of you can touch just very briefly, you have a question from Tamara Livingston about the implications of your work for smaller institutions. And again, we're short on time, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of our goal is to, with the site visits and also with the surveys, to at least get some kind of feedback from smaller institutions. And so the site visits that we've done so far, not all of them are giant ones. Some of them were geographically convenient for us because of the places where we're living, but we're hoping that when we're able to resume site visits, and when we're able to expand that, if we receive funding, then our goal is certainly to include as many, as a wide a variety of smaller institutions as possible. Certainly there are multiple shops that we've already been to where there are, 3 or fewer people who are actually doing this work. And so it is something that is very much in the talking about scale and seeing how these things, work across different types of workforces is a thing that we want to be thoughtful about.
And one thing I'll say about that is just that when we did visit smaller institutions, we found actually a lot of commonalities, which was something that Rosemary and I were concerned about. But whether you're small or big, work being valued and work being under-resourced and all of those things are the same or can be the same. So we found a lot of commonalities with small institutions, actually.
Well, thank you again, both Meaghan and Rosemary.